This is the JLU Knowledge Series and the 6th edition of JLU Knowledge Series webinars, which have been brought to you by Jharkhand Lake City University, which is Central India's #1 university since last about 5 years. The university has, almost about 56 degree programs at undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral levels. Our students come from almost about 8 to 10 countries from the world, along with all over India, all the states of India. More importantly, we have about 27 international universities as partners to us. And believe me, they are exciting partnerships with the world's best universities. And that keeps us going and doing a lot of work which a good university should do. Today's session, there will be 3 sessions for the entire day. The 3 sessions have been curated by Jharkhand School of Public Policy International Affairs. We are starting with the first session, and it will go on till for about an hour or so, and then followed by other 2 sessions. It's been about 75 years that the United Nations came into being. At the very heart of this particular spirit of multilateralism, and Article 55 of UN Charter essentially says that it enables the countries to be prosper, to develop the quality of life for them. A lot has happened over the years, ranging from focus on women to SDGs to children, peacekeeping, and so many other things. But come November 2019, and the world flips on its head. COVID-19 changed the entire lens and frameworks of the world, and a lot of conversation narratives is being weaved around this particular phenomenon of COVID-19. And to talk about it, to kind of share his insights and perspectives on the new world order, as many of the people are calling, and also to kind of look at this global village, as we call it, not only from an international affairs perspective, but also maybe from a practice perspective. We have Mr. Jethwa, who's one of the foremost thinkers and global affairs experts. Before I get and request Mr. Jethwa to kind of speak to you directly, I just wanted to kind of dwell on where he comes from and who is he. Very interestingly, when I learned about it, he's a neuroscientist as well as an advocate, admitted to the High Court and Supreme Court of Victoria in Australia. Jay is currently the globally elected Australian representative to the World Federation of the United Nations, headquarters in New York and Geneva. He's also the senior advisor on the board of Association of University of Asia and Pacific. Jay is a director of a number of healthcare related companies in Australia and India, and that makes him extremely profound when it comes to discussing and dissecting and giving a perspective on COVID-19 and the global affairs. He spends his time between business communities in Australia, the UK, United States, on both UN and NGO related activities that he's part of. Jay also officially is a mentor to students of University of Melbourne, Australia. And by the way, let me just tell you, Jay is an extremely good well-wisher and a friend of Jharkhand Lake City University. He takes part in spiritual activities as well as services at Sri Sathya Sai Ashram in South India. I present to you Jay Jethwa, who will be talking about how COVID-19 has almost given a knockout punch to multilateralism and what are the real implications of it. Jay, over to you, please.
Thank you, Professor Diwakar, for that introduction. Before I start, actually, let me just say that, look, in fact, I go to China quite frequently for a number of reasons, UN related as well as universities related. And as it happens, I was actually in Beijing in November for a UN meeting. Now I'm just beginning to hear that the first cases of corona actually appeared in November itself when I was there. And I was wondering why there were not so many people in the streets of Beijing. So now, looking back, it makes sense why this was happening. But fast forward that to January, and I was in New York actually for about 3 weeks. And interestingly, we had the first case of coronavirus in New York City, the first one in the US, in fact. And I was really quite amazed that one case, I wonder how many is actually going to increase that number by. And now, it's more than 1.2 million throughout the US, and almost half of them are actually in the state of New York. So I must say that I dodged both China as well as the US when the pandemic actually took over. So I'm very grateful to God actually that I left those two countries right in time to be here today. In fact, I was on my way to Australia. I was in India and my flights were actually cancelled. So that's what brings me here today. So, excuse me. So I thought let's talk about something very topical at the moment. And I think everyone in the world today, whether you're in a small village in Africa or whether you are at the highest level of any country in the US or Russia or China or wherever it is, everybody's talking about the coronavirus. So, having said that, I thought let's see multilateralism. You know what effect it has on multilateralism. And as you know, my association with the United Nations, UN is actually the principal multilateral organization in the world. So I thought maybe this would be a topical area of interest, perhaps to you, all of you students who may be considering something in the future as far as policy decisions are concerned, or health, or in fact, international relations. So I started researching this a couple of days ago, and in fact, I was even quite surprised at what is actually happening around the world. So please bear with me for the next 10 to 15 minutes while I read out something to you. So as I said, Professor Diwakar, thank you for inviting me to present at this webinar. I've actually organized my brief talk along the following 5 lines to make, to give you some clarity of where I'm coming from and where I'm going to end up in this short webinar. So number 1, I will define what multilateralism is and give examples of some of the biggest and most important multilateral organizations. Number 2, coronavirus and its implications for multilateralism. Number 3, I will talk about the geopolitics of COVID-19. Number 4, international relations and multilateral diplomacy in the times of coronavirus. And finally, number 5, I will conclude by saying that in the fight against COVID-19 pandemic, in the medium term, international cooperation by way of multilateralism will be our best weapon. So those are the 5 principal areas that I will touch on today. So all of the above are underpinned by policy decisions that governments will make around the world in the coming weeks. Now, I'm talking about the coming weeks. I'm not talking about the coming decades or the coming years. This pandemic, this particular small, invisible virus has actually made us think in a much, much faster way and in a globalized manner. So we are talking about just the next few weeks when the governments around the world will come up with their own policies. So times have really changed. And I doubt very much, to all of you students, I doubt very much whether you will see these times again, ever in your life. You will probably talk about this to your children and to your grandchildren. The fact that you actually lived through this particular pandemic. So make the best use of this. Start to think differently. Start to think about the way you are thinking rather than the system by which you've been thinking all your lives. In fact, I'm starting to do that myself. So, keep that in mind whilst I'm actually talking about this, because this is going to affect each and every one of you. It doesn't matter what you are actually studying, what discipline you're in, but this is going to be of critical importance in the way that you are thinking. So I'll come back to my first point, which is, what is multilateralism? Generally speaking, it is the principle of participation by 3 or more parties, especially by the governments of different countries. But in political terms and in international relations, it refers to an alliance of multiple countries pursuing a common goal. Now, some examples of multilateral organizations include the UN, NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the European Union. Another good example is the treaty signed by nearly 200 countries on nuclear non-proliferation to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. NATO, the UN, and the European Union are all products of a rules-based multilateral order that was established in the aftermath of the Second World War in the mid-1940s. This multilateral order, which includes trade and other economic rules and regulations, have helped to spread unprecedented prosperity to many countries and regions of the world, and have underpinned the growing openness and interconnectedness of our economies. However, and this is very important, however, multilateralism can only operate in the geopolitical context within which it actually exists. The unfortunate event of the corona pandemic is eroding the very foundations on which the multilateralism of post-Cold War era stood. So it's been nearly 70 odd years, on which that we have stood on this pillar of multilateralism. But it's all about to change at the moment. Number two is the coronavirus and its implications for multilateralism. The COVID-19 pandemic is a wake-up call for multilateralism. Trying to cope with the immediate devastating effects of the virus, nations have turned towards imposing unprecedented executive measures, including closing borders. Entire manufacturing and distribution systems have come to a grinding halt. Unemployment is at an all-time high throughout the world. Developing countries got a triple whammy: the pandemic, the food shortages, as well as unemployment. And I think it's very good for you students to actually keep this in mind as to what can happen in the future. And we can talk about that in more detail if you have any questions later on. So, Dr. Divakar, I can actually hear someone in the background.
Yeah, just give me a second. I think, yeah, there are some sounds behind. Let me just sort it.
Okay. Just let me know when you're free or when you're done.
Yeah, Jay, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the pandemic also poses a significant threat to the maintenance of international peace and security, potentially leading to an increase in social unrest and violence, undermining our ability to fight the disease. This is already in evidence in Venezuela, for example. And one of the main pillars of the United Nations is actually peace and security. So I think it comes directly under its purview of how countries are going to manage this particular pandemic when there is a threat to international peace and security. The policy decisions that governments take in the next few weeks will probably shape the world for years to come. In fact, for decades. They will shape not just our healthcare systems, but also our economy, our politics, and our culture. But the policymakers are caught between a hard rock and the deep blue ocean. What takes precedence, health or the economy? We can debate this later on at some other time. A knockout punch by coronavirus of multilateralism means that the road to recovery for almost all of the countries will be that much harder, especially the developing countries and those in conflict and post-conflict zones where health systems are less prepared. I hope, truly hope, and I pray that we are not heading towards the 1930s style Great Depression. And I'm just reading in the papers right now that the way things are actually panning out economically, socially, and culturally around many countries, over 100 countries, we are unfortunately heading towards a depression. Now, whether it is the same as the Spanish flu, which killed nearly 70 to 100 million people. I'm sorry, I don't know how to convert that into Indian lakhs and crores, but I think you students may know 70 to 100 million people were actually killed. And then the Great Depression, 1918 and 1919, that itself killed so many millions of people. So I just hope that we are not heading towards that. So that leads me to my third point, which is the geopolitics of coronavirus. The magnitude and the speed of contagion has turned great geopolitical swathes into quarantine zones, and lockdowns have already taken a toll on economic activity, along with physical and mental health of millions of people around the world. There have been deep interconnections and vulnerabilities created by globalization between democratic and authoritarian states. Some states are beginning to weaponize these channels. And I think you may know what I'm talking about, using this as a weapon. So if you take China, for example, it threatened my country, Australia, last week that unless you stop asking for a review of what actually happened in China back in November and December, unless you stop doing that, we are going to stop our students coming to China and also our tourism into China. And I must say that Chinese are some of the biggest spenders. In fact, we earn more revenue from China than any other country. So this will have a major effect on our economy. So luckily, I think Australia is not pandering to their thoughts and their wishes, and still inquiring about what actually happened in China. So many other Western countries, including Australia, US, UK, and the EU countries, have demanded the role played by WHO in towing the Chinese line during the initial phase of the pandemic. I'll talk about this a little bit later on. While there are debates about the impending changes of the post-pandemic era, with some saying that there will be a complete shift of the global world order, and others arguing against it and making the cases for a gradual return to normalcy. I don't really think that we'll be in a normal situation anymore. I think it will be a different situation. It won't be business as usual. That's my personal view. So the fourth point that I'd like to talk about is the international relations and multilateral diplomacy in the times of coronavirus. So this is where the UN comes in. Multilateralism and diplomacy is the DNA of the United Nations. Diplomacy is the lifeblood of open, globalized world, and this channel has been severely disrupted by the pandemic. This makes the situation even more problematic on top of the health issues. The World Health Organization is a specialized agency of the UN, and it's very important for you to understand. I think we lump WHO and UN together in the same breath, but you must understand that it's a specialized agency of the UN, and it has its own board of directors, its own separate budget, its own independent operations, and it seeks funding independently of the UN. It only reports to the UN, and the UN does not interfere in the workings of the World Health Organization. Now, WHO's priorities include providing access to universal health, preventing communicable diseases like polio, for example, and researching factors that affect health. Now, I know personally in my days of medical research many years ago in Australia, we were a coordinating center for WHO, and I know the type of work that was being conducted. It was really quite fantastic. What we are talking about today is really the management of WHO, not what WHO does, but how it is managed by its board of directors, by its secretary general. So please keep that in mind for the future. And WHO's purpose is to direct and coordinate health for its signatory nations, provide leadership, and determine paths for research. There has been much criticism of WHO during this pandemic, not least because it was seen as towing the lines of Chinese Communist Party. The reason I use the word Chinese Communist Party is we must remember that it's not the Chinese people that we are talking about. It's really the Chinese Communist Party that calls the shots. It's only a one-party system. You cannot do anything in that state unless the Chinese Communist Party actually approves of that. So it's the Chinese Communist Party and not the Chinese people. They are in fact affected just as much as the rest of the world. There may be some justification for this, and appropriate authorities around the world are looking into any collusion between WHO and the Chinese Communist Party. So let me come back to the geopolitics of the situation here, as far as WHO is concerned. Now, I think most of you will know that the Secretary General of WHO, Mr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, comes from Ethiopia, a country where China has a large and growing navy and port facilities. Ethiopia's strategic position in the Horn of Africa is critical for China's long-term strategy of controlling the Indian Ocean. It is also an important part of China's Belt and Road project. Now, Mr. Tedros was appointed the Secretary General of WHO at the insistence of China. The US appeared to have opposed this appointment 2 years ago. It's a 5-year appointment, by the way. Investigations are ongoing on the role of WHO in not declaring this a pandemic earlier. My personal take on this is that there will be far-reaching changes to the entire structure of WHO and the way it operates. I guess we just have to wait and see. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to be long and draining. It will make diplomacy, and especially crisis diplomacy and international relations, harder. But it is crucial to keep channels of communications and spirit of cooperation intact in a period when the international system seems as ready as ever to fragment. So, in concluding, I say that a virus knows no borders. All countries are affected. The fight against this global pandemic, which is taking so many lives and challenging so many societies, requires enhanced international cooperation and worldwide solidarity. If the global economy is to avoid prolonged economic distress, a coordinated policy response, as advocated by the United Nations and other multilateral policy institutions, serves as possibly the most promising path out of a looming economic crisis. In the fight against COVID-19, national responses are vital, but in the medium term, international cooperation will be our best weapon. And reforming and reinforcing the institutions like the WHO and mechanisms that underpin such cooperation will be our best defense against future global threats. So there I end my brief talk, and I invite Professor Diwakar to take this further.
I think, you touched upon pretty profound 5 points, and I was kind of listening to you, and as I was thinking about some of the set of questions which I want to put up to you, and many of these questions have definitely come from some of our people who have registered for this webinar, including students. So it was pretty interesting, and I think it just tells us how exactly this entire contours of multilateralism are being played out as of now. And Jay, I also realized there's a lot of historical, trend, the way that multilateralism has fared over the period of time. So whatever some of the questions which I'll put up to you would have that particular context as well. My first question to you is that you spoke about this knockout thing, and when I use a knockout, I use it in a contextual term. Does this also mean that the free borders, the integration of economies that we see across the countries, movement of people across the countries, and also resources being shared very freely at many times, are going to be the thing of the past?
Well, interesting question, Professor. Let me just say that the answer to that would be a yes and a no. That is a very typical lawyer's answer. However, let me predicate all of that by saying, well, look, let's look at what is happening in Europe, for example. We've got the European Union. There are so many countries within that particular system, and yet when Italy was affected so badly, with over 1,000 people dying every single day for more than 2 months, borders were closed. They did not have a coordinated response to one of their own members able to cope with something like this pandemic. Now, I understand that nobody foresaw something like this particular virus taking over the world, but that's why you have risk management systems in place, and yet this was not in place, and many of the countries within that system had actually closed their borders to stop people traveling between those countries and stop this particular virus. So as far as the borders are concerned, I think yes, there is going to be there are going to be some changes made around the world, not just within the European system, but within Africa. There are 52, 54 countries in Africa. And depending on how this particular pandemic goes, I think that you will see the borders being closed within Africa, within Europe, within some Asian countries also. So as far as the economy is concerned, economies were only integrated because of something what we call global value chains. So let me give you an example of the global value chains. Raw materials were sourced from one country, value added in a second country, transported to a third country for assembly, for example, and finally shipped out to many countries as finished products. Now, whichever way you look at it, as an economist or as a government, that system was always likely to fail, because any system is only as strong as the weakest chain that there is. In this particular case, the global value chains always started and ended up in China. Every single country had their products and services made in China. So I think this has really open the eyes of many, many countries right now and say, well, which way do we go? Do we regionalize these global value chains? Do we make it into our own country, like what the US is saying at the moment? We want these industries to come back to the US. Europeans are saying the same thing. We want these vital industries. Look at the PPEs, the personal protection equipment. How ironic is this? You know, that China, where this entire virus thing started, got affected so badly. It went overseas. European countries, Americans actually sent the PPEs, whatever they had, to China. Now they're left with no PPEs, and China is selling it back to them. So look at the weakest link here, and that is China. Everything was being manufactured in China. So I think I foresee all this production and manufacturing to take place on regional basis now, whether it is in Southeast Asia, in Asia, maybe South America for that continent, in one country in North America. So I think the only reason, as I said, coming back to your point, was we were integrated. Economies were integrated only because of that global value chain. And I think that is going to be broken, possibly in the next few months. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that was a good point, Jay, that you made. And it just takes me to the next question which I had in mind. And I was thinking from a perspective of this crisis and the way, and because you talked about the crisis communications and the crisis management per se, the frameworks that the world has built up. So essentially, crisis comes in, in two variants. Those ones which we are not prepared because we don't expect them to come and hit us. And the second variant is obviously which we should have been prepared because they were expected in certain sense. So COVID-19 essentially comes into the second kind of a variant category, which was expected that something of this pandemic would happen. I mean, of course, coronavirus could be having any other kind of a variant of a virus, but the way the world has been, kind of behaving environmentally, and a whole lot of other issues also at the background of it. This was kind of coming. Such crises and such pandemics are around the corner in any case. Now, having said that, my question was, and I think you have touched upon it in your presentation, but I still wanted to request you to revisit it, is to see whether COVID-19 would remake the world in a very larger sense, as I said. Also, I say this is because in terms of a long-term political implications, we see rise of authoritarianism happening around the world. We see a very polarized kind of an paralyzed debates happening across the world when it comes to, again, integration and consensus on common policies. For example, look at immigration policy itself. It's a big issue and debate which is happening. So your views on the remaking the world of this COVID-19?
Well, I think my intuition, and I think intuition of almost every single one of you, will say that there will be changes. So if you look at some example, maybe if I give you an example of globalization, globalization brought many advantages to many people and to many countries, from movement of people around the world, for a better life in other countries, for example, to movement of goods and services around the world. But for this came disparities between those who actually rode on the train of globalization and those who were never given the opportunity to be on the train in the first place. So that brought disparities, and hundreds of millions of people were left behind in this particular scenario. So I see that globalization, on one hand, it's a good thing that we can actually learn from each other, we can share ideas, we can be innovative in the way that we want to deal with other cultures, other people, other technologies, whatever it is. But I think it brought this particular disadvantage to many hundreds of millions. Going by what is happening currently with unemployment of people all over the world, and particularly in India, where our young people is, what is it, about 40% of people in India are under 40 or 30 or something like that. Yeah. So this is going to have a major impact on the Indian population, and particularly students. If you're listening, students, I'll talk a little bit later about the way that you should go about this in the future. But I can tell you this is going to change the ways you actually think. And that's for the better, by the way. Things are not going to be the same. So I think you should be ready for a different way of thinking.
Jay, I'm an economist also by training. So my next
okay, there we go.
So my next question essentially has a bit of that as well, and kindly allow me to elaborate, because when I was thinking about and trying to put it in a context and pose it to you. So essentially, we all know that the idea of global trade essentially, and we all know that this is supposed to be the engine of global economic welfare, prosperity, and so many other things. And multilateral approaches to establishing liberal trade regimes, as people have talked about, has been seen as one of the basic tenets of modern trade economics. Now, post World War II, as we all have read it, this thing came up very, very well. I mean, there was a lot of liberalization in terms of the developing countries benefited a lot from the industrialized nations, and a whole lot of those things happened under the custodianship of GATT, as well as now later on WTO. However, in 2008 and 9 scenarios, the Great Recession, recent recession, it actually shook it all. But certainly everybody went into their own shells, and there was a lot of protectionist policies, and those things started coming into being. But then again, post that, once the confidence came back in the economy, the worldwide, again there was a huge amount of efforts to kind of integrate and see, kind of a collaboration on larger perspectives. Again, and I was reading it somewhere. I read this former head of WTO, Pascal Lamy, talking about something which he talked about as he called it as a regulatory convergence, where he essentially said that the important countries have to come together and they have to ensure that this multilateralism should not disintegrate. We have also seen, Jay, that a lot of things are happening when if you talk of bilateralism and plurilateralisms are happening. Agreements between countries and blocks happening, but this is all getting threatened, no doubt. So my question was, this particular narrative of that multilateralism in a larger sense is going to be threatened by post-COVID-19. Is it a short-term cyclical thing, or is it really going to happen? Because that's why I gave you a kind of a context to is that we have been reacting to things and then go back to where we want to be. So is it a cyclical thing or a natural thing, or is it like a short-term phenomenon?
Yeah, interesting, Professor Diwakar. You see, by nature, our bodies are made to react to certain things, whether it is to light or to heat or to taste, we react. That is our nature. If we extend that out to economies, if we extend that out to countries, how they go about doing their businesses, let me tell you that once you react to a stimuli, that stimuli stays with you for a long time. If you have never touched a hot stove and you touch it for the first time, you will always remember that I don't have to touch that again. Okay? So, putting that in context here, this is such a great event that is taking place. And that is why I said in my talk that these times we will never, ever forget. And in fact, we are going to pass this down to our children, our grandchildren, to say, I lived through this pandemic. That means in some industries and in some areas, we will obviously have to still go about doing the things that we are doing. Okay? In majority of the cases, more than 50, 60, 70%, I think we will change our behavior. So this has to do with our behavioral changes more than the changes that we have to make in our trade policies, for example. We have understood what this global value chain has done to us over the past 3 months. Only 3 months, the world has changed. People have realized that we rely too much on one particular country. So how do we change the system? That system is not going to happen overnight. It may take some time, could be 6 months up to a year, but we have to come up with solutions to this now and say, how do we manage this? How do we manage working from home? I mean, it's ridiculous. People in one of my companies, in the healthcare company, we've got magnificent offices and blah, 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 all the usual stuff, okay, IT related. All of a sudden, in 3 days, we had to make sure that 200 of our employees were working from home. Each one had to be given a secure laptop. So that cost money, that caused change in behavior, not only of the company, but of people who actually had to work from home. It took about 3, 4, 5 days for those people to get used to the fact, number one, that they're working from home. Number two, that they don't have to wear their suits and their pants. You can still be in your pajamas and still do your work. Number three, you will see your dogs and your cats behind you and your children behind you shouting. I mean, it was unthinkable previously that major news organizations like CNN working from home and seeing all these cats and dogs and things behind the screen. So what that has meant is we have changed our behavior. And so the governments in their policy decision-making frame moving forward, they have to change the behavior. And this will change. I can guarantee you this is going to change. There'll be some aspects that will be the same, but majority of those things have got to change.
That's a very interestingly you put it, and because I've been wondering while you were speaking, I was wondering, it's such an exciting area to kind of decode this international relations and international affairs, diplomacy, and the connecting between the nations and multilateralism being the core of something which you talked about. My related question, because there are lots of students who are already studying for public policy and administration right now, not only at our university, but there are others also who are wanting to be in this particular sector. What do you think, Jay, since you've seen so much, what are the career prospects for students who want to specialize in international affairs and public policy at the global level?
Yeah, really interesting, actually. For those students who are actually listening in, let me put it, perhaps I can give you my example. Okay, I think that might put it in more of a perspective than somebody just talking from the top of his head. So I think, as you mentioned, I started off my life as a scientist, and then I moved on to law, and then I moved into education and UN and all that sort of stuff. But one thing that I'd like to say is, don't use the word specialized or specializing in international relations or specializing in economics or specializing in X, Y, and Z. I'll predicate by saying that if you're a doctor, you will always remain a doctor. Okay, you can specialize into different things, but you are essentially a caregiver. But in many other industries, international law, whether it's medicine, whether it's a law, you're a lawyer, or whether you are working in some other field. The point I'd like to say to your students is, don't specialize too much. Those days have gone. Today, you have to be a fantastic generalist. That means you have to train your brain. In fact, let me tell you a little bit about the brain, okay? Coming from a neurosciences background. Your brain in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, they've discovered that there is such a thing called the plasticity of the brain. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
Plasticity. Yes. So the plasticity of the brain means that doesn't matter what you do, your brain will compensate with another part of the brain. Okay? If for example, if you suffer from stroke, one part of your brain dies, right? But that function that was being carried out by that particular map in the brain is overtaken by another part of the brain somewhere else. So it's a living thing that changes by itself, depending on the circumstances. So the reason why I'm telling you this is, don't think of yourself as an economist only. Don't think of yourself as an international relations expert. It's good to be an expert. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But please broaden your mind and say, what I would like to do is I will do X. I would like to see what other aspects I can apply my mind to add value to something else from what you have learned. Value addition in each step that you take. So that actually gives you a beautiful overview of your life, essentially, of what you can actually achieve. So international relations, fantastic. I think it's a great subject. Geopolitics, journalism, obviously, is another area, but it doesn't mean that you become a journalist for the rest of your life. You don't die. You don't die as a journalist.
Yeah. Very true.
So it's like a religion. If I'm born in one religion, I don't necessarily have to die in that religion. I can expand my horizons into spirituality and other aspects of what we are trying to learn. So I think it's very important for your students to always remember. Oh, by the way, there is a great book that I must tell you that your students should read and buy if they want to. And it's called The Brain That Changes Itself. That's the name of the book.
Right.
And it is by Dr. Norman Doige, D-O-I-G-E.
Okay.
Okay. Read that book, and I think that will open up so many possibilities for you in what you want to do.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Jay, for telling us this book, and you said it so well. And I'm happy that you kind of reignited this particular part of it, because at our university, and us well, we have been trying to create this multidisciplinary integration of studies and schools and things, because this is really what we want. And in the space that I and my colleagues are working also in communication, I think it's all about the way that a brain functions, the way it behaves, and certainly you open up new possibilities. So thank you so much for that. I have just one more question, and one more thing, Jay. I kind of recalled something which you said earlier. You talked about this Belt and Road Initiative of China. At that point of time, I was wondering, because Chinese and many of such nations are missing a point. Because if they want Belt and Road Initiative to succeed, and they're putting so much investments in that, they'll have to also understand that they'll have to do away with the trade barriers and countries and protectionist policies also, which people, because only then it would flourish. Same thing the US is doing it, where they have a great investment lined up for transport infrastructure initiatives. It will never succeed unless the world is one and there are more of a multilateralism and multilateral institutions playing a role there. So it's something it struck me. It's been a fabulous thing, and I if I had to take away a few things from what you said, somehow I feel that it is absolutely important for the world to have a renewed commitment to many things on a global level. Obviously, multilateralism was thought to be one of the ways in which the approach is that we can succeed together. Maybe we need to relaunch, Jay, this entire narrative of multilateralism and its role itself, reinforce it to some extent. I would definitely feel, and this is what keeps on coming up, as this multilateralism and this collaborations worldwide has to take care of a lot of keep a focus on vulnerable geographies and peoples and a whole lot of agendas which are deprived and very many people take it. Because I think the tension is happening between haves and have-nots in a different frame
Yes.
now. That
Yes.
has to be in mind for the world to flourish more.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Quite right.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Jethwa, for giving us this time and doing this with us. I really look forward to catching up with you when you visit our campus. And maybe I was thinking we'll do a fireside chat again on a topic which is of interest to you and where you can help us, understand more about things. Maybe do this in the fabulous media studios that we have in the campus. So I really look forward.
Okay.
Yeah, you must visit us next time. There's so many things, and Jagran is full of public policy and international affairs, which is involved to be part of it. So I really look forward to welcoming you back at the campus, and thank you so much for doing this for us and giving your time. So really obliged.
It's been a pleasure, and I hope particularly for your students. I'd like to reinforce the point again once more, please, if I may, is moving forward in your life. Just remember that things ain't going to be the same anymore. It's going to be very different to the world that your fathers and your grandfathers and your peers have known. And I think you must keep an open mind. Try to look laterally now. Okay, think out of the box right now. Opportunities are fantastic at the moment. Doesn't matter what line of education you do. The first bit of education you do, as far as a bachelor's degree is concerned, is just shows to someone that you've got the brains to do it. But that's all. It doesn't tell somebody else how good you are in that thing. But it means if you've got the brains to do your bachelor's, you've got fantastic brain to do so many things at the same time. Don't restrict yourself to one thing in your life, because it's not going to serve you very well.
Fabulous. As our motto says, JLU's motto says, igniting mind and changing lives. I think you really have started to, by telling us these things, changing lives to a greater extent. So thank you, Jay, once again.
Great. It's been a
viewers, hang in there as we have another great and amazing session coming with Professor Dr. Sairam Bhatt, and we have our Dr. Yogesh Srivastava moderating that session. It is around the environment and policy implications a bit.
Good.
So see you on the other side. And thank you, Jay, once again. And thank you.
Thank you. And goodbye to everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks.